Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I'm going to be working on a project today that is intended for my D&D game. My players are going to be going into this underground cavern that's going to have giant spiders, giant snakes, things of that nature. So I want to make some nests with eggs. And I'm going to take you through the process here today. This technique, if it works out well, I've never actually done it before, so this might be a fail, but if this works out well, potentially you could use it in other types of terrain, and the terrain potential for this could be used certainly in your Warhammer, the old world upcoming games as well, I suspect. So the materials that I'm using, these are pencil sharpener shavings. I have a tube of acrylic paint. This is a dark brown, it's a raw umber. Some latex gloves. This is some watered down PVA, Elmer's style glue. So just a bottle of PVA glue. And I'm going to use a container to do my mixing. And I'm going to be building the nest on some parchment paper. I do have some rare earth magnets here, so I am planning on putting this inside the bottom of the nest during the construction building process here. And this is just for storage and transportation purposes, so this is totally optional. And probably could be done after the fact. I'm going to try to do it while the nests are drying.
The reason for the parchment paper is that the nest that I'm building will be consisting of the paint, the PVA glue, and the pencil sharpenings, and kind of mixed into like a oatmeal type consistency and then left out to dry. So the PVA, in my experience, won't adhere to the parchment paper. So once the nest is dry and hopefully fairly rigid and sturdy, I should be able to then just peel it off the parchment paper. Now the catch here is, especially with the PVA, that it takes a long time to dry. And when I say a long time, I'm talking about kind of days. I get the pencil sharpenings moist and get that moisture just mixed in there. I'm using my hands here. You could probably, if you had like an old wooden spoon, you could probably use a utensil that might be easier. I don't know. I found it easier just to use my hand with the glove. And I wasn't really measuring here. I was just going for an oatmeal-like consistency. I added in the paint, and then once I felt like I had the right color, I start adding in my PVA. And again, I'm not really measuring here. I think you definitely want to have a fair amount of PVA in there, because I think that's the main component that's going to give you a final result that has some sturdiness to it. If you're interested in seeing more projects like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Subscribing is a great way to support the channel. I get to the point where I feel like I have the right consistency, and I go to place my 3 rare earth magnets down on the parchment paper, and I'm just going to kind of put my mound of material on top of them, with the idea being is that they'll dry and the rare earth magnet will already be inside at the bottom. Again, this step is totally optional. I'm just thinking about potentially transporting some of the terrain and just having it in a case that has a metal bottom, and then I could confidently know that they're not going to be moving around with the other terrain for transport purposes here. After I have my rare earth magnets down, I grab just a handful of the material, and I'm just kind of mashing it into the shape that I want. So however it is when you leave it is how it's going to be when it's dry. And again, I end up leaving this for like 5 or 6 days, and it needed all of that time in order to dry. It is winter here, so I think temperature, and I also think airflow can affect this greatly, but you're not going to have any airflow where the material is making contact with the parchment. And also the temperature will be less of a factor for that point of the project. So it did take a long time. If you're going to use this method, I think it's something you just have to be patient. You really want to leave it and let it dry. But I get all 3 nests into the shape that I want, and I leave them. And I was surprised, actually. I thought I was going to have extra material, and it did take a substantial amount of the batch that I made. I ended up using all of it just to make these 3 nests. And these came out of an electric pencil sharpener, not a hand one. A hand one would have taken forever. So I'm a school teacher, so I have access to that pretty easily. But it probably ended up sharpening like 100 pencils to get the amount that I needed. So after about 6 days, I was able to peel them off, and they actually dried really sturdy. So it did take that entire time, though. So be patient. So before I did anything else, I want to just reinforce that rare earth magnet. In the area where the rare earth magnet was located at the bottom, I added some super glue, kind of as a just in case, with the thought in my mind being, every time you pull this thing off of a metal surface, obviously it has some pull on the magnet, and I wanted to make sure that it seemed really unlikely that it was going to pull the magnet out. And now I think that might have been accomplished already, but I didn't think there was any harm in just adding a layer of super glue there, so I went ahead and did it. I'm going to be using some dry brushing techniques as we go through and do the painting here, but before painting, I also decided, you know what, I'm just going to put a layer of PVA on the outside of the terrain project at this point, top and bottom, let it dry, and then flip it over and repeat. The reason for this for me was just kind of locking in any pieces that maybe they were on the edges, and they were kind of falling off a little bit as I was handling them, and I was like, oh, I'll just lock everything in with a thin coat of PVA glue. When it comes to making the eggs, you obviously have a ton of various options. I was considering 3 options here. So one was with the green stuff. Now, if you're not familiar with green stuff, it has 2 components. Usually it's like a blue and like a yellowish, greenish yellowish color. You mix them together, you get a dark green material. This application is typically used when you're wanting to modify a miniature or add something onto a miniature which you're intending to sculpt on. Green stuff is expensive, but it is fairly easy to work with, and it dries, and it's particularly sturdy and hard when it dries, and it dries relatively quickly. I typically am able to move on to whatever my next step is after about an hour or so with a high level of confidence. If you wait 12 hours, you're absolutely good to go, in my opinion, but it also depends on the thickness of your material. The other 2 components I was considering working with were the milliput as well as the DOS clay. My DOS clay was really old and it was crumbly, and I had to abandon that. So I was interested in seeing how the 3 materials compared to one another, but I had to abandon the DOS clay. The milliput, similar to the green stuff, at least the one that I have, had the 2 components that I had to mix together. And I do have to admit, man, the milliput for me was pretty messy. So my technique is just to get the amount of material I think I need for the size of the egg that I want. I kind of, in my palms, I roll it into a ball, and then I just kind of, once it's in a sphere, I just take it and I roll it, and pressing on 2 sides, and then you get kind of that ovally egg shape. So it's not overtly complicated, but the milliput left a residue on my hands, and it wasn't as easy to work with as the green stuff. Now, the milliput's not cheap either. I think it probably might be cheaper than the green stuff, but I was also surprised at the price of the milliput, although I did purchase this particular milliput some time ago. When comparing the outcome of the milliput and the green stuff, I actually couldn't tell a difference between the 2 in the finished product. And actually, even now, well, without watching the video, I'm not sure I could tell which terrain piece has which material. So from that regard, it's ideal, right? You don't want one to if one's superior, then you would want to use the one that's superior. So the reason I don't show you working with the green stuff is that whenever I had a project where I was using the green stuff on a miniature, I always find that I have extra. Like, I always overestimate how much green stuff I need. And what I was doing for probably 6 months with this project in mind was just taking whatever bit I had left over and making 1 or 2 eggs and just setting those aside. So those were made over the course of like 6 months off camera. But the exact same process to make them. The green stuff will, in my experience, stick to your hands less than the milliput. The age of my milliput might be factoring in here, though, so your results may vary, but my hands were a mess. Finally, on to the home stretch here, the painting process. I put another layer of that base coat just to cover up any of the PVA that might have still been visible or not quite as translucent as I wanted it to be. The milliput eggs are the ones on the left paper plate. I primed both sets of eggs with a spray paint can primer. I think I used Army Painter. It's like a leathery type color. So it's kind of a middle shade brown, with the idea of I was just going to dry brush on a series of kind of dark ivory, medium ivory, light ivory highlights on to hopefully get that egg effect, which I'm desiring here. But before doing that dry brushing, I wanted to have a solid base coat. So it was hard to prime these because I didn't tape them down or anything, and they're trying to roll around on me. So it took a few attempts at priming them, and even then I still felt like, they didn't have total coverage. So I went in with a similar color acrylic paint and touched up the base coat before dry brushing. On the nests, I do 2 highlights with the dry brush. With the dry brushing, I usually will move immediately from one color to the next, and I think it gives you a little bit of a blending effect here. I'm using a makeup brush, I assume large. I don't use a lot of makeup brushes on my face. When I say I don't use a lot, I mean I use 0. But yeah, I just bought a bulk supply of makeup brushes. I find that they're really good for dry brushing. With your highlights, you're just getting gradually lighter. So I think picking out 2 or 3 colors, the more colors you get, the more of an effect you can have in terms of the blending. But 2 or 3 is usually what I go with on a project like this. And I'm going to use the exact same process with the eggs as well. The reason I don't glue the eggs in and paint them inside the nest is I felt like I could paint them faster if I painted them loose and then glued them on. You could glue them in place and then you'd have to go a little slower on the painting because you wouldn't want to get the ivory colors on the nest itself. So that's an option. I felt like, I'll make a mess of things. I'll get paint all over my fingers, but I'll be able to paint these fairly quickly, which I definitely was able to accomplish all those things, including the mess. So I go through, I add 2 or 3 highlight colors on all the eggs, going up to kind of a light ivory, and I think the overall result is pretty good. Once I did have them glued in place, I did actually go back and just do some few highlights here, but I thought if you're going for optimum speed, I think it's better to paint the eggs prior to gluing them in place. After the paint on my eggs dry, I go ahead and use my super glue to glue them in place, kind of in a randomly, kind of a hodgepodge order that seemed to be pleasing to the eye at the time. In the 3 nests, obviously the larger the nest, I figured the more eggs it would have. And in this application, it's kind of an abstract thing. This could be potentially dragon eggs, giant snake eggs, spider eggs, and of course all those eggs in nature would actually look different, but in a fantasy type game, I think there's a little bit of abstraction there that's just fine in my opinion. With the eggs in place, I did go back and just highlight a few areas there that seemed like they needed it, whether it was from coverage or just missing a spot or whatever the case may be. But again, focusing on not getting any of that paint on the nest material itself. Using my super glue, I added a little bit of flock on the sides of the nest, the idea that it might look like a little bit of mossy areas, and I thought that that would add just another color and another element to the terrain piece. This step is optional, and if you didn't want to use super glue, you can use the PVA as well. The super glue is going to dry faster, but I think they'll both give you a similar result. I did spray these 3 pieces with a matte varnish once everything was dry, and here's the final result. I hope you enjoyed this project. Could be used for objective markers in your Warhammer The Old World games, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.